Before the Ardennes awoke to the chaos of war, there was only quiet, a deceptive calm that stretched across Belgium's frost-lined forests. Dawn settled on 16 December 1944, pale light filtering through tall pines, dusting frozen leaves and the low mist that clung to the ground. To the Americans watching the horizon, this forest seemed harmless, even protective, a barrier forged by time and distance. Yet beneath the silence, German forces had assembled in secrecy, the largest offensive since 1941, poised to strike with a precision that no one yet imagined. Along the thin American line, divisions were scattered and weary. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, their breath curling in icy air, clinging to the assumption that winter would restrain the enemy. Roads were quiet, patrols cautious but unthreatened, and the forest itself appeared to hold the front steady. This trust, however, was built on ignorance. The calm of the Ardennes was a mask, concealing the rumble of engines, the calculated march of men and armor, and the weight of an offensive that would soon shatter all illusions. Without warning, the first shells tore through the quiet. Explosions erupted like a storm from a clear sky, splintering trees, hurling smoke and earth into the frost. Communications faltered instantly. Radios failed, wires snapped, and the Germans exploited the confusion with meticulous efficiency. They moved in silence through fog, coordinated by plans that had anticipated every Allied assumption. What began as a calm morning became a theater of immediate and disorienting destruction. Far to the west, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne rested near Reims, their morning interrupted by fragments of the catastrophe. Snippets of radio chatter, scattered reports of artillery and burning villages, and the distant rumble of advancing forces hinted at an unimaginable scale. Each fragment painted only a partial picture, but the shadow of disaster was unmistakable. Meanwhile, Eisenhower received confirmation that the Germans intended to split the Allied front, a maneuver that, if successful, could sever the continent and isolate armies before reinforcements could arrive. At the center of this emerging storm lay Bastogne. A small road junction, overlooked in peace, now became the linchpin of Europe's fate. Every crossroads, every highway, every ridge would be contested. In the coming days, this modest Belgian town would bear the full weight of strategy, courage, and survival. The 101st Airborne received orders with a sense of urgency that left no room for questions. Move immediately. No maps, no full briefing, only the stark imperative that time had run out. Men gathered their gear in near silence, the weight of uncertainty pressing against them harder than their packs. The crisis they were being summoned to was vast, but how vast, none could know. All they understood was that the stakes were impossibly high. Trucks roared through frozen roads, engines struggling against ice and snow, while paratroopers attempted to rest sitting upright on wooden benches. Their bodies ached from the cold and from weeks of weariness, yet their minds remained alert, straining to absorb every fragment of information. Each mile carried them closer to a battlefield they could not yet see, a confrontation that promised to test their courage and endurance in equal measure. Sleep, when it came, was fitful, haunted by the ghost of an unknown threat lurking just beyond the fog. Even as they moved, intelligence reports trickled in. Entire regiments were vanishing beneath armored thrusts, villages swallowed by a sudden, precise, and devastating enemy advance. Radios crackled with fragments of despair and confusion, painting a grim mosaic of destruction across the Ardennes. Commanders realized that the Wehrmacht had not only seized initiative, but had reshaped the battlefield entirely, turning roads and forests into a maze of danger. Amid this chaos, Eisenhower issued a command that left no margin for hesitation. The nearest reserve, the 101st, must hold Bastogne at any cost. The words carried with them the weight of consequence, the silent acknowledgement that failure here could unravel the entire Allied front. Every man understood that what awaited at Bastogne would be more than a test of tactics. It would be a test of endurance, discipline, and will. As the trucks crested the final ridge, the cold became an enemy in its own right. Fingers numb inside gloves, breath crystallizing in the air, soldiers confronted the merciless winter that slowed every movement, chilled every thought, and sapped strength with quiet efficiency. By the first light of dawn, the division arrived, and discovered the Germans were already closing in, the distant rattle of tanks and rifles hinting at the storm that would descend fully in hours. By mid-morning, the Germans had moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Armored columns streamed through the Ardennes, encircling Bastogne with a precision that bet. Raid careful planning and ruthless efficiency. The town, modest in its size, suddenly found itself at the center of a tightening vice. Every road leading in or out seemed occupied by tanks, half-tracks, and infantry, their engines and treads swallowing distance with terrifying speed. Reconnaissance patrols returned with grim reports, panzers to the north, south, east, and west. The forested hills that had once promised cover now framed a circle of steel and fire. For the 101st Airborne, the reality was immediate and stark. They had arrived just in time, but time had delivered them into a trap. The sense of urgency that had carried them over frozen roads transformed into a weight that pressed on every man's chest. There would be no easy advance, no safe fallback, no margin for error. Above, the Luftwaffe re-emerged, streaking over the town in jagged arcs of gray and silver. Bombs and strafing runs sliced through the morning haze, sending clouds of dust and splintered masonry into the streets. Supply lines choked under the assault, trucks stalled in ruts or burned along the edges of the roads, leaving only fragments of materiel and desperate drivers. The sky itself seemed to have become another front, indifferent to the men huddled beneath it. Artillery followed swiftly, carving Bastogne into splintered stone. Shells struck with a rhythm both relentless and random, toppling walls, shattering windows, and leaving streets lined with debris. The paratroopers dug in, their shovels biting frozen earth, their rifles cradled and ready. Retreat was no longer a possibility. They could only hold, withstand, and endure. In the hearts of those defenders, something firm took root. Bastogne would not be abandoned. The pocket forming around the town was not a mistake of strategy, but a crucible forged by men who refused to yield. Every barricade, every trench, every improvised strongpoint was a testament to resolve, a declaration that even when surrounded, determination could define the shape of battle. In Berlin, High Command studied maps and reports with an almost clinical confidence. They believed that lightly armed paratroopers, no matter how resolute, could not withstand the weight of massed armor. In their calculation, Bastogne was merely an obstacle of negligible significance, a waypoint on the road to a larger victory. The generals plotted movements with precision, coordinating 5 Panzer divisions to converge on the town from multiple directions, envisioning a swift encirclement that would render resistance meaningless. Their expectation was simple. American infantry, thinly spread and poorly equipped to resist tanks, would fracture under the pressure of encirclement. Every column, every maneuver, every plan rested on that assumption. Confidence in the Wehrmacht's speed and discipline was unshaken, bolstered by intelligence that suggested winter would immobilize Allied air power, leaving paratroopers exposed, vulnerable, and isolated. Tiger II tanks rolled forward with terrifying ease, their heavy tracks crunching frozen earth, engines humming a low, menacing chord that seemed to reverberate across the Ardennes. German logistics, already stretched thin by months of campaigning, were pushed to the limit. Fuel, ammunition, and rations moved in precise coordination, a gamble dependent entirely on rapid success. Weeks would be catastrophic, days were imperative. Each command decision, each calculated risk, was underwritten by the assumption that the Americans could not and would not hold. Yet in their strategy, the generals interpreted the unfolding resistance in Bastogne as evidence of desperation rather than design. Where men dug trenches, fortified crossroads, and reinforced positions, the Germans saw panic, not preparation. From the High Command's vantage, the offensive was almost mechanical in its inevitability. They visualized armor cutting through the Ardennes with ruthless clarity, forcing paratroopers into submission or annihilation. Maps and charts became narratives of anticipated collapse. Roads would be seized, bridges destroyed, villages bypassed, and the pocket reduced to rubble within days. The human factor, the courage, endurance, and improvisation of men standing against impossible odds, was largely absent from their calculations. Yet the very assumptions that seemed so certain were fragile. The paratroopers of the 101st, experienced in improvisation and acclimated to adversity, had already begun shaping Bastogne into a fortress of will and ingenuity. Every barricade, every sniper post, every machine gun emplacement was a counterpoint to German expectation. The defenders were not merely reacting. They were asserting control over the terrain in ways that High Command had not accounted for. Bastogne, in the mind of its defenders, was no longer just a town. It was a statement that even the heaviest armor could be contained by determination and planning. As the Tiger IIs advanced and columns converged, the Germans believed victory was imminent. Yet what they did not yet recognize was that speed alone would not decide this battle. The men of the 101st had arrived in time not to flee. but to hold, to resist, and to define the first shock of a winter that would be remembered for decades. The men of the 101st Airborne quickly grasped the significance of Bastogne. It was no ordinary town. 7 roads converged here, arteries that fed the movement of men, vehicles, and supply lines across the Ardennes. To hold these crossroads was to halt the advance of German armored divisions and prevent them from reaching the Meuse. Every soldier understood that the fate of the broader front could hinge on their actions in these frozen streets. Officers addressed their troops with clarity born of experience. "We are not trapped. We are anchoring the line." The words were not intended to sugarcoat the danger, but to reframe it. The paratroopers were not merely defending territory. They were assuming responsibility for the entire front. Each man became a linchpin in a chain whose strength would be tested by steel, fire, and endurance. Understanding the gravity of their mission transformed fear into a quiet determination, one measured in careful planning and the relentless fortification of position. Roadblocks rose across the town, crude yet formidable. Frozen earth was piled high, shattered stone and abandoned vehicles arranged to halt tanks or force them into narrow, predictable paths. Soldiers worked with shovels, axes, and sledgehammers, shaping Bastogne into a defensive lattice. Every barricade carried with it a moral weight. It was not just wood or stone, but a statement of refusal, a promise that retreat would not be tolerated. The men knew that their labor might be tested in minutes, yet each effort became a quiet act of defiance. The paratroopers prepared for the worst. Bazookas were loaded, aimed, and drilled for use at ranges of less than 100 yards. Every weapon, every emplacement, every soldier's stance was calibrated to meet the armored threat that loomed beyond the ridges. They understood the odds, they understood the power of the enemy. And yet they worked with a discipline that allowed courage to grow from preparation, not from hope alone. Below the streets, medics converted cellars into makeshift aid stations. Wounded men began to pour in, their cries muffled by layers of stone and timber. The wounded were stabilized and tended, but no illusions were offered. Survival would depend on both luck and the steadfastness of those still fighting above ground. In this subterranean world, quiet diligence preserved life, while above, roads and barricades prepared to deny it to the enemy. Morale hardened, not from optimism, but from purpose. Every act of construction, every barrel of ammunition readied, every position manned became a reinforcement of collective resolve. The paratroopers of the 101st were anchored in a reality that demanded endurance, courage, and cohesion. Bastogne was more than a crossroads. It was a crucible in which the character of men and the momentum of a campaign would be tested. Panzer commanders arrived at Bastogne confident that the town would fall within 48 hours. Their maps, schedules, and calculations left little room for error. The Americans were expected to crumble beneath the weight of armor. But when the first assaults were launched, the paratroopers refused to yield. They clung to every hedgerow, every wall, every crater, transforming the landscape into a maze of resistance. Each position taken was a calculated defiance, and each moment of resistance chipped away at the certainty of German planning. Assault after assault met with failure. German officers, accustomed to rapid breakthroughs, were forced to reroute units, navigating around the stubborn pockets of American defense. Paths that should have offered clear advance became obstacles of fire and steel. Every detour strained supply lines already stretched thin. Fuel shortages, once manageable, deepened with every unexpected turn. Tanks stalled in snowdrifts and rutted roads, their engines growling in frustration as the ground froze and cracked beneath them, immobilizing machinery designed for speed. Winter long considered rifle into one of the most enduring platforms in military history. The M16's various upgrades, the M16A1, A2, and later models, would emerge as reliable, versatile weapons adopted by armies around the world. The innovations that had once seemed to betray the soldiers in Vietnam were refined and perfected, making the M16 a trusted tool for countless military engagements. The rifle's transformation from failure to reliability became a testament to the resilience of those who worked to fix it, and the soldiers who continued to rely on it, despite its tumultuous past. But despite its eventual success, the early years of the M16 remained a shadow in its legacy. For all its later triumphs, history remembers the failures with a quiet ache for what could have been avoided. The lessons of the M16's early years were painful ones, learned too late to spare those who fought in Vietnam. The rapid pace of technological progress had clashed with the slow, steady march of caution and thoughtful judgment. The M16 was a reminder that while technology can change quickly, the consequences of human decisions rarely do. The early mistakes, the rushed deployment, and the political pressure that drove them, these would be part of the rifle's story, part of the history that would never fade. The M16, a weapon meant to save lives, had instead become a tool that taught a harsh lesson in the value of caution and preparation. Its flaws, revealed in the heat of battle, would shape military policy for decades to come. The story of the M16 was not just one of technological advancement. It was one of accountability, of understanding that ambition must be tempered with humility. The lesson it imparted was one America would never forget, that while innovation can pave the way for the future, it is only through experience, reflection, and care that true progress is made. But what they didn't know was that even as the M16 was reshaped into a symbol of modern military success, a new generation of challenges would soon test its legacy. Would the lessons learned from its troubled past be enough to meet the demands of the future? Or would history repeat itself, this time with a different weapon and a different set of assumptions?
When Melissa stepped back, the judge turned to Blake. "Mr. Morgan, your response." Blake rose with calm assurance, a slight smile curling at the corner of his mouth, the smile of a man holding a hidden ace. "Your Honor," Blake began, "the petitioner's claims are not just exaggerated, they are deliberately misleading. My client is fully competent, and we have evidence." He pressed a button on his tablet. "I'd like to play an audio recording." Andrew stiffened. Melissa's shoulders jerked. The courtroom speakers crackled for half a second. Then Andrew's voice exploded through them, raw, unfiltered, furious. "Your money belongs to me, you old fool." A collective gasp rippled through the room. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. Even the court stenographer paused, fingers hovering midair. The recording continued, Andrew's escalating rage, Melissa's false sympathy, the manipulation woven into every word. The judge's face hardened with every second. When it ended, silence swallowed the room. Andrew stared straight ahead, pale as paper. Melissa's hands trembled, but not from emotion. Rage simmered beneath her composure. She shot Walt a look that could have cut steel. Blake let the silence burn before he spoke again. "This does not sound like a concerned son. This sounds like financial coercion." The judge nodded slowly. "Agreed. Do you have further evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor, Detective Doyle does." Detective Corinne Doyle rose from her seat near the back and approached the stand. She carried the folder containing Melissa's forged doctor reports, documents the guardianship filing had relied on. "These," Doyle said clearly, laying them out one by one, "were submitted as medical evaluations of Mr. Jennings. They are fake. The listed physician did not write them. The signatures were forged, and the content matches a known fraud pattern associated with Mrs. Melissa Jennings." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Melissa's face twitched, just once, before she forced her expression back into something neutral. Andrew looked at her then, truly looked, realization creeping onto his face like a spreading crack in a foundation. He hadn't known. He hadn't known she planned to cut him out. Didn't know she negotiated to sell the house. Didn't know he was being used as much as he was being weaponized. The judge leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Mrs. Jennings," he said slowly, "do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Melissa opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted between Doyle, Blake, and the judge, calculating, searching for an angle that no longer existed. "Very well," the judge said. "Given the evidence presented, this court is ordering a full investigation into the petitioner's claims and the validity of all documents submitted." He paused, gaze landing directly on Andrew. "And until that investigation is complete, the guardianship petition is suspended." Walt felt the tension in his chest loosen for the first time in weeks, but Blake didn't smile, and neither did Doyle. The judge's voice took on a deeper gravity. "This case," he said, "is far from over." Andrew slumped into his seat. Melissa stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles trembled. Walt watched them both, knowing one thing with absolute clarity. The firestorm had only begun, and the next round would be even more dangerous. The courthouse hallways looked different the second time Walt walked them. The first hearing had felt like a siege, ambush, accusation, the threat of losing control over his own life. But today carried a quieter tension, the kind that comes before a decisive shift. Blake walked beside him, calm as always, a binder under his arm. The judge ordered an independent evaluator who has no connection to either side, Blake reminded him. This is good. No bias, no manipulation, just facts. Walt nodded, though he didn't need reassurance. For weeks, he had lived under a cloud of fabricated decline, treated like a man shrinking into confusion. But he knew his mind was still sharp, and after everything Andrew and Melissa had done, he was ready to prove it. Inside a small evaluation room, the court-appointed specialist, a woman in her 50s with clear eyes and a firm handshake, introduced herself. She administered memory tests, reasoning problems, financial judgment scenarios, orientation questions, assessment interviews. Walt approached each task with focus, answering calmly, demonstrating the same meticulous attention he once used in his accounting career. Halfway through, the evaluator smiled softly. "Mr. Jennings, you're doing exceptionally well." Walt didn't smile back. "I should be. I've spent a lifetime keeping things in order." By the end of the session, she thanked him and escorted him out. "I'll report my findings to the judge directly," she said. "But I can tell you now, there is no cognitive decline." Walt exhaled slowly, a controlled release of relief, pride, and something deeper, vindication. Back in the courtroom, Andrew sat at the petitioner's table, fidgeting with his tie. He looked worn, drained, less polished than before. Melissa sat beside him stiffly, arms crossed, avoiding everyone's gaze. The judge entered, everyone stood. "We will review the evaluator's findings," the judge announced, "then hear additional argument." The evaluator approached the stand, raised her right hand, swore in, and delivered her assessment cleanly. "In my professional opinion, Mr. Walter Jennings exhibits full cognitive function. He is mentally competent, financially aware, and capable of independent decision-making. There is no indication of decline." Andrew's head snapped toward her. Melissa's jaw tensed as if she'd bitten down on something sharp. The judge nodded. "Thank you, that will be entered into the record." He turned to Andrew. "Mr. Jennings, your petition claims your father is mentally deteriorating. Please present your evidence." Andrew rose, visibly rattled. "Your Honor, he forgets things. He repeats himself. He misplaces paperwork." The judge raised a hand. "Evidence, Mr. Jennings, not opinions." Andrew swallowed hard. I don't have documents, but I know what I've seen." "You submitted forged medical reports," the judge reminded him. "That was," Andrew faltered, "that was Melissa's idea." Beside him, Melissa's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. Blake leaned over to Walt and whispered, "They're splintering." The judge turned to Melissa. "Mrs. Jennings, would you like to testify?" Melissa lifted her chin. "No, Your Honor. On advice of counsel, I invoke my rights." A murmur moved through the courtroom, shock, suspicion, recognition. The judge made note of it. "Very well," he said. "The court finds the petitioner has failed to provide credible evidence of cognitive decline. In fact, the material presented suggests deliberate manipulation of the guardianship system." Walt felt his spine straighten, a warmth rising through his chest. He didn't smile. He didn't speak, but the truth settled around him like armor. The judge continued, voice firm. "The guardianship claim filed by Andrew Jennings is hereby suspended indefinitely pending further review." Andrew sank into his chair as though his legs had given out. Melissa stared straight ahead, teeth clenched, refusing to look at anyone, not even Andrew. The judge added, "Additionally, The court will examine the potential misuse of forged documentation in this case. Blake glanced at Walt, eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. When court adjourned, Walt stood, picked up his coat, and walked toward the aisle. Andrew rose as if to say something, maybe an apology, maybe another lie, maybe a plea. But Walt didn't pause. He walked past his son without turning his head, without offering a glance, without giving him even a fragment of acknowledgement. The message was clear. The power had shifted. Andrew watched him go, face pale, caught somewhere between fear and realization. Realization that the narrative he tried to construct had collapsed, that the father he underestimated had stood taller than he ever expected. When Walt reached the doors leading to the hallway, he felt the weight of months begin to shift off his shoulders. But he also knew something else. They weren't finished. Not yet. The courtroom felt heavier this time, not chaotic, not fiery, just thick with the residue of truth closing in on someone who had run out of places to hide. Walt sat beside Blake Morgan, shoulders relaxed, posture steady. He had learned something in these last weeks. Stillness could be stronger than shouting, and truth, real, documented truth, had its own gravitational pull. Across the room, Andrew couldn't sit still. His knee bounced, his fingers drummed on the table, and sweat gathered at his temple despite the cool courtroom air. Melissa, noticeably absent today, had left him to face the unraveling alone. Without her rehearsed expressions and whispered coaching, Andrew looked smaller, like a boy pretending to be a man he didn't understand. The judge looked down at the file. "Mr. Jennings," he said, "you stated you had new information to present regarding your father's estate and alleged agreements." Andrew stood quickly, too quickly, nearly knocking over his chair. He forced a breath, trying to settle into confidence that no longer belonged to him. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "My father, he promised me early access to my inheritance. He said I'd get the house, and some of the savings, years ago, he made those promises." Blake didn't react, Walt didn't react, but the judge raised an eyebrow. "And you have proof of this agreement?" the judge asked. Andrew swallowed. No written proof, but he said it many times. Blake pushed back his chair and rose with the soft authority of a man who knew precisely when to strike. "Your Honor," he said, "we would like to submit a counter-evidence packet." He handed the judge a neatly bound folder. Inside, spreadsheets, bank statements, and security logs glinted under the fluorescent lights. "For the last 18 months, Blake continued, Andrew Jennings had unauthorized access to his father's personal accounts. Our forensic accountant verified repeated withdrawals totaling." He paused only for effect. $18,000. Gasps murmured from the gallery. Andrew's face flushed red, then white, then red again. That was a loan," he stammered. "Dad said it was okay." Walt didn't move, didn't blink. Blake shook his head. "If that were true, Mr. Jennings, why did you disguise the withdrawals as online purchases? Why route them through temporary accounts? Why delete the email alerts?" Andrew opened his mouth, but no explanation formed. The judge flipped through the logs. "This is concerning." "And there's more," Blake said, stepping aside so Detective Doyle could approach. She carried a slim folder, one that looked deceptively light for the weight of what it contained. Doyle greeted the judge and turned to the courtroom. "In our investigation," she said, "we obtained phone and message records that show Melissa Jennings coached Andrew on how to structure and deliver his claims. She instructed him on phrases to use, symptoms to describe, and how to exaggerate normal behaviors into signs of cognitive decline." She handed copies to the judge. "In one message," Doyle continued, "Melissa wrote, stick to the memory angle. Say he forgot bills, say he repeated things. Judges fall for that." Another rustle of shock filled the room. Andrew shook his head violently. "She only meant she was helping, she didn't." His words collided with each other, collapsing before they could form a defense. Doyle's voice remained steady. "Mr. Jennings, do you deny your wife coached you?" Andrew ran a hand through his hair, wild and panicked. "I know, yes, she just, look, I'm trying to protect my dad. He promised me things, he owed me. You don't understand." The judge leaned back. "Mr. Jennings, you've provided no proof of any promise, but we do have proof of theft, coercion, and attempts to deceive this court." Andrew's breath quickened. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in. That was when Walt finally spoke. He rose only slightly enough for his voice to carry. Calm, controlled, a tone grounded in heartbreak, not anger. "Andrew," he said softly, "I taught you better." The words struck harder than any accusation. They weren't loud, they weren't sharp, but they were devastating. Andrew froze, tears suddenly welling in his eyes. He shook his head like he could outrun the truth closing in. "No, Dad, you don't get it. I need it." He blinked rapidly, but the lies still came, reflex, habit, desperation. "She told me it was the only way. I didn't mean to. You forced me to." His sentence broke apart, incoherent. The judge watched him with a stern, measured expression. "Mr. Jennings," the judge said firmly, "this court has serious concerns about your behavior. Continued dishonesty in these proceedings may result in criminal charges." Andrew sank into his seat, trembling, eyes darting between Walt, the judge, and the floor as if searching for some place safer to look. But there was no safe ground left. Blake sat back down beside Walt, exhaling slowly. "The tide's turned," he whispered. "He's losing his narrative." Walt didn't answer. He watched his son, broken, cornered, unraveling, and felt a weight settle in his chest. Not victory, not satisfaction. Just the solemn recognition that truth, once released, couldn't be put back in the box. And the consequences were only beginning. The sun had barely set when the pounding began, fierce, uneven blows that rattled the front door like someone was trying to break it off its hinges. Walt had just finished washing dishes, the soft clinking of plates replaced by the violent echo of fists slamming wood. He froze. He knew that rhythm. He'd heard it half a dozen times since the guardianship filing, the knocking that wasn't knocking, the pounding of a man who came demanding, not asking. He stepped toward the door cautiously. Through the window's edge, he saw Andrew swaying on the porch, his posture sloppy, his movements jagged. Even from inside, the stench of alcohol seemed to seep through the glass. "Dad," Andrew shouted, slapping his palm against the doorframe. "Open up, we're talking now." Walt didn't unlock it. "Andrew, go home, you're drunk." Andrew laughed, a broken, bitter sound. "Yeah, I'm drunk because of you, because you ruined everything." He slammed the door again, harder this time, rattling the pictures on the wall. "You destroyed my marriage," he shouted. "Do you hear me? You destroyed it." She left. She packed her bags and left because of what you did in court. Walt's heart tightened. "Andrew, Melissa didn't leave because of me. She left because you found out who she really was." "That's a lie," Andrew barked. "You turned the judge against us. You made her look guilty, you." His words slurred into each other, anger melting into grief and then back into fury. Before Walt could respond, a car screeched to a stop outside. Headlights washed across the yard. A door slammed. "Melissa." She stepped out wearing a tight coat, makeup smudged, eyes wild with a mix of rage and desperation. She stormed up the lawn toward Andrew, grabbing his arm. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. "You're ruining everything." Andrew yanked his arm free. "Me? You lied to me. You tried to sell his house without telling me. You were going to cut me out." Melissa's face contorted. "You idiot. You were supposed to keep quiet. You were supposed to hold it together." "I lost everything because of you," Andrew screamed. "You lost everything because you're weak," she fired back. Their shouting escalated like gasoline meeting a flame. Within seconds, Andrew shoved her. Melissa shoved back harder. It spiraled into a frantic, messy fight, arms flailing, voices cracking, the kind of chaos that belonged in police reports, not suburban front yards. Walt stepped onto the porch, hands raised. "Stop, both of you, this isn't helping anything." Melissa turned on him instantly. "This is your fault, you manipulative old bastard. You want him to hate me." Andrew lunged at her again, stumbling, grabbing her coat. She slapped him across the face. He shoved her backward and she fell into the damp grass, screaming curses. At that moment, Carl Benton came rushing out of his house, phone already recording. "Hey," he shouted. "Enough, Walt, stay back." Seconds later, another car pulled up, Detective Doyle's cruiser. She stepped out fast, hand on her holster but not drawing, assessing the situation with the speed of someone who'd seen domestic violence unravel in seconds. "Enough," Doyle barked, voice sharp like a cracking whip. "Both of you step away from each other." Andrew stumbled backward, chest heaving. Melissa scrambled to her feet, hair wild, eyes darting like an animal cornered. Doyle pointed at Andrew. "You, hands where I can see them." Andrew complied, shaking. Then she turned to Melissa. "Melissa Jennings, step forward." Melissa scoffed. "Why, I didn't do anything, he assaulted me." Carl lowered his phone. "Detective, I got it all on video." Doyle didn't even need it. She looked Melissa dead in the eye. "We already have more than enough. The forged documents, the attempted financial theft, the break-in, the deleted recordings." Melissa's face drained of color. "You're under arrest for fraud and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult," Doyle said, reaching for her cuffs. "No, no, you can't do this, Andrew, tell her, Andrew." Melissa shrieked as Doyle pulled her arms behind her back. But Andrew didn't move. He just stood there, deflated, watching the only person he thought he could rely on being taken away in handcuffs. As Doyle guided Melissa toward the cruiser, Andrew suddenly pointed a shaking finger at Walt. "This isn't over," he said, voice ragged. "You hear me? A judge is gonna make this right. You can't just erase me. You'll regret this." Walt looked at him, not with anger, not even with fear, just a hollow sadness that settled deep in his bones. "I never wanted this, Andrew," he said quietly, "but you didn't give me a choice." Andrew blinked, his expression collapsing into confusion, grief, fury, none of it forming into anything coherent. He stumbled backward toward his car, hands trembling, eyes glassy. Carl stepped beside Walt, steady as a pillar. "You did what you had to," Carl murmured. Walt didn't answer. He watched the cruiser door shut on Melissa, watched Andrew sway beside his car, watched the remnants of his family fracture under the weight of their own choices. Heartbroken, but resolute. Because tomorrow, the legal fallout would begin. And this was only the final spark before the explosion. Walt sat in Blake Morgan's office again, the same mahogany table, the same framed law degrees, but the air felt heavier, thick with the aftermath of Melissa's arrest and the broken pieces of Andrew's unraveling. Blake had called him in urgently, asking him to come alone. No explanation, no hint, just a tone in his voice Walt had never heard before, something between gravity and apology. Blake closed the office door behind them, walked to his desk, and set down a slim, faded leather folder. It looked old, older than Blake, older than Walt's own retirement papers. The edges were worn, the leather cracked, as if it had waited decades to be opened again. "Walt," Blake said, pulling out the chair across from him, "I need you to sit." Walt did, slowly. Blake took a breath. "What I'm about to show you, your father intended for you to know eventually, but he asked me to keep it sealed until certain conditions were met." Walt frowned. "My father, Blake, Dad's been gone 40 years. "I know," Blake said, "but he planned for the long game." He opened the folder. Inside were documents stamped with dates from the early 1980s, bank statements, letters, account authorizations. Walt leaned forward, heart tightening as he saw the signature at the bottom of the first page. "Tom Jennings." His father. Blake slid the top sheet toward him. Walt, your father left you a second inheritance account, separate from the one you already received when he passed. Walt blinked, confusion clouding his face. A second inheritance. Why didn't I know about it? Because he didn't want Andrew to know, Blake said quietly. He feared what your son might become, even back then. Walt's breath hitched. Blake continued, voice gentle but unwavering. Your father asked me to keep this sealed until either you turned 70 or until Andrew displayed behavior proving Tom's concerns were justified. Walt stared at him, stunned. He predicted this. He predicted all of this. Blake nodded slowly. He wrote you a letter. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed at the corners. Walt recognized the handwriting immediately. His father's sharp, deliberate cursive. His throat tightened as he unfolded the paper. Walt, the letter began, you have always been a better man than me, patient, forgiving, generous to a fault. But your kindness could one day be your undoing. I see something in Andrew, a hunger for what he has not earned, a belief that what is yours is his by right. I pray he grows out of it, but if he does not, then this account is my protection. One day your salvation. Walt's eyes blurred. He kept reading. You must never tell him about this money. Not until he proves he values you more than he values what you leave behind. The words cut deeper than any wound Andrew had inflicted, because this wasn't recent. This wasn't sudden. This was a shadow his father had seen long before Walt ever knew to look. He lowered the letter, hands trembling. I failed him, Walt whispered. I didn't teach him right. I didn't correct him early enough. Blake shook his head softly. Tom didn't think you failed him. He thought you loved him more than he deserved. And maybe that was the problem. Walt closed his eyes, letting the grief wash over him. A grief not for the money, but for the decades of blindness, the years of hope that Andrew would become someone else, someone better. How much is in the account? Walt finally asked. Blake hesitated only a moment. As of last month's calculation, $3.2 million. Walt didn't speak, couldn't. The number didn't feel real, not because of its size, but because it represented his father's distrust, his foresight, his warning. A knock on the office door interrupted the silence. A court clerk stepped in, handing Blake a new envelope. For the Jennings hearing, sir. Blake thanked him and opened it. Inside was the judge's written notice regarding Andrew's petition. Blake scanned it, then looked up at Walt. He's barred. Walt blinked. Barred from what? From accessing any part of your estate, Blake said. Present or future. The judge says Andrew's behavior disqualifies him from serving as guardian, beneficiary, advocate, or executor, permanently. Walt felt something settle inside him. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a deep, heavy finality. A door closing that he had spent years trying to keep open. But the news didn't reach Andrew gently. An hour later, Andrew burst into the courthouse conference room where Walt and Blake were reviewing filings. His face was flushed, eyes red from crying or anger, likely both. You hid money from me, Andrew shouted. $3 million. You kept that from me my whole life. Blake stood protectively between them, but Walt raised a hand. Andrew, he said quietly, your grandfather kept it from you, not me. Andrew staggered backward, shaking his head violently. No, no, you don't get to do this. You don't get to shut me out. I'm your son. Walt met his gaze, steady, sorrowful, unwavering. And you tried to take everything from me. Andrew's face crumpled. You don't understand, he whispered hoarsely. I needed it. I thought it would make everything right. Walt let out a long, trembling breath. Money doesn't make a man right, Andrew. Character does. Andrew sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands, shoulders trembling. He looked broken, not because of the money itself, but because the last thread of his imagined entitlement had snapped beyond repair. The judge's order lay on the table between them, a line drawn in ink, final and unquestionable. Andrew had no access to the inheritance, to the house, to anything. Blake closed the folder and looked at Walt. "This changes everything. You're protected now." Walt nodded slowly. For the first time, he finally saw it clearly. Not just who Andrew had become, but who he had always been. And who Walt needed to be moving forward. The courtroom battle wasn't over yet. But the power had shifted forever. The courthouse felt strangely quiet the morning Walt filed the no-contact order. Not hostile, not heavy, just quiet. As if even the walls understood what this moment meant for him. Blake walked beside him carrying a thin stack of finalized documents, but the emotional weight of them was far from thin. "You're sure you want this permanent?" Blake asked gently as they reached the clerk's counter. Walt nodded. "I've been sure for a long time, I just wasn't ready to admit it." The clerk reviewed the paperwork, stamped each page with a loud, decisive thud, and slid copies back across the counter. "Mr. Jennings," she said, "once this is processed, Andrew and Melissa are legally barred from contacting you in any form. Phone calls, visits, messages, anything becomes a criminal violation." Walt breathed out slowly. It wasn't relief. Not yet. It was something closer to release, the loosening of a rope that had been wrapped around his chest for months, pulled tight by betrayal and heartbreak. "Thank you," he said and meant it. As he stepped outside into the cool mid-morning air, clouds drifting lazily overhead, Walt felt the magnitude of the moment settle over him. He had severed the last tether. The legal war wasn't fully over, but the personal war, the one clawing at his heart, had taken its final blow. He climbed into his truck, dialed his phone, and waited for Blake to pick up. "Next step," Walt said, steadying himself. "Let's finish restructuring the estate." Blake's voice warmed. "Already prepared. When do you want to sign?" "Ode," Walt said. "I want everything locked down today." By afternoon, they were seated in Blake's office again, reviewing trust documents, inheritance allocations, and protective clauses strong enough to withstand any future attack, even 1 decade away. "I've divided the assets the way I want," Walt told him. "The primary estate stays in a protected trust, and the second inheritance that needs a different purpose." Blake nodded. "You mentioned charity." Walt looked out the window at the city below, people walking, living, struggling, surviving. "Yes. Martha always said money should help people who haven't had the breaks we did. I want part of the inheritance to fund scholarships, and part to support the youth center." Blake smiled softly. "She'd be proud of that." "And the rest," Walt continued, "goes into the long-term trust, accessible only if I approve it, no one else." Blake nodded. "I'll put everything in motion." Hours later, after the ink dried and the documents were filed, someone knocked on Walt's door just as twilight settled over the neighborhood. Carl Benton stood outside with a folder tucked under his arm and a determined look on his face. "We held a neighborhood meeting," Carl said. "People want you to know they're with you. You're not alone in this." He opened the folder and handed Walt a stack of letters, handwritten notes from neighbors up and down the street. "We've seen you walking your route for years. You're sharp as ever. We heard what Melissa did. We stand with you. Anything you need, Walt, anything." Walt scanned each letter, his throat tightening. He cleared it softly. "I don't know what to say." Carl smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just know you've got people in your corner." Walt set the letters carefully on the hall table, a testament to the power of chosen family. He felt something shift inside him, something warm and fragile.